So how fast were those cars going when they hit? In 1974, Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer did a study where they showed test subjects videos of cars hitting each other. And then they asked them this question about how fast were the cars going when they, and they filled in the blank differently for different groups of people. Now, here's what they found. When they filled in the blank with the word contacted, about how fast were the cars going when they contacted, then the subjects guessed on average that the car speed was 31.8 miles per hour. When they filled in that blank with hit, as in how fast were the cars going when they hit, the speed went up to 34 miles per hour. Bumped, 38.1. Collided, 39.3. And you can probably guess that when subjects were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed together, that the highest estimate of all, they got the highest estimate of all, which was 40.8 miles per hour. Now that's pretty crazy, right? You got all these subjects seeing the same video of the same cars crashing at the same speed, and yet depending on how the researchers phrased the question, you could have a variance of almost 10 miles per hour in the answers. Now, Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer concluded from this research here that we have to be very careful about the kind of questions we ask eyewitnesses. We don't want to lead them along. Now, I'm going to add to that one conclusion we can draw is that language is not neutral. We'd like to think that language just describes the world as it is, right? That's a tree. Tree describes that thing over there. There's no emotion going on there. But in fact, language is not neutral. It shapes our perceptions. It shapes our emotions. So we can witness the same event, and when asked different questions about that event using different language, it can make us re-perceive in our minds or even rewrite our memory as to what happened. And if you would like to look at more on this, the article I looked at is listed there. Okay, now when you think about how language shapes perceptions, it may seem pretty obvious too. For example, if I call something a snack, that's fairly neutral. If I call it a treat, that's a little bit more positive, right? Implies this cookie is something I'm happy about. If I call it a guilty indulgence, that's perhaps even more positive because the guilty part implies that this is really something pleasurable. But if I just call it junk food, then suddenly it's not quite so positive, right? Same cookie, different feelings associated with it depending on what I call it. Again, language is not neutral. It shapes our perceptions. It shapes our emotions. Okay, now I want to talk about a few terms related to the different shades of meaning associated with different words. Now, perhaps you've heard the terms denotation and connotation before. I know they're words that we like to use in English classes. Because some of the standards involve you being able to look at words and sort of tell what the shades of meaning are, or to be able to choose the right words to get the shade of meaning that you want in your writing. Okay, but denotation is the explicit or direct meaning or set of meanings of a word or expression as distinguished from the ideas or meanings associated with it or suggested by it. Connotation, the associated or secondary meaning of the word or expression in addition to its explicit or primary meaning. Now, what does that mean in easy speak? We talk about denotation as being the dictionary definition of the word. A friend is someone that you have kindly feelings toward that perhaps you hang out with. Okay, the connotation is the feeling you have about a word. So if you call someone a friend versus a pal versus a close acquaintance, all of those words have different shades of meaning. Now with connotation, there may be shades of meaning about a word that everybody shares, in which case, honestly, when you look in the dictionary, usually the dictionary tells you that the word has those feelings associated with it. But words may have personal connotations for you depending on your past experience. Take this example. The denotation of a fur coat is that it's an article of clothing, it's made out of animal skin. The connotation that may be associated with fur coat, it may represent money, may represent glamour, or it may represent cruelty and selfishness, or it may just represent something that old ladies wear that is not in fashion anymore. Now, as a good writer, you need to be aware of the feeling surrounding words, the connotation of words, and you need to try and choose words carefully to produce the right effect on your reader. Now, you also need to be aware, of course, that other people will be trying to use words to influence you. Take, for example, this sentence, which comes from a website which is, the point of which was to sort of campaign against Mike Bloomberg. It was created by the NRA. What Bloomberg and his elitist cronies will never understand is what saves the Second Amendment is the tidal wave of support from the majority of the American people. Now, you may agree with the sentiment here, But take a look at what the writer is doing with the language. You may notice that the words elitist cronies stand out. Okay, if you're talking about something being elite, you're talking about it being the best of the best. And yet when we say something's elitist, that usually has a negative feeling. It implies you're sort of snooty. There's some snobbery there, even though the word itself may sort of mean superior. Now, cronies, again, we could have used a different word here. We could have used pals. We could have used his co-conspirators. Okay, cronies to me conjures up images of fat men smoking cigars in dark rooms, plotting about how they're going to take advantage of loopholes in the government and manipulate people. Okay, it's not a word that has a positive connotation. Now think how this sentence might have sounded if they had, instead of saying elitist cronies, they said superior friends. What Bloomberg and his superior friends will never understand is what saves the Second Amendment is a tidal wave of support from the majority of the American people. The sentence loses a lot of its bite. When we're talking about language that seems deliberately designed to manipulate our emotions, we might call that loaded language. Now, loaded language includes the examples of things that are very clearly manipulative, the words that people use that seem designed to make us angry, the name calling we hear sometimes in politics. Loaded language, though, can also include the sort of softening of unpleasant terms. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that, although this is not a political example. If you go to the grocery store, you might see a sign like this. In aisle 5, you can find family planning, feminine hygiene products, feminine protection, sanitary protection. You know what all those things refer to, right? Okay, but each of those terms is a soft way of referring to something associated with something people may not like. Now, family planning, that's a very soft way of saying contraception, or here's where you get your condoms. When we deliberately soften up an expression, we use a gentler term in place of a harsh term. We call that a euphemism. So that's a substitution of a mild, indirect, or vague expression for one thought to be offensive, harsh, or blunt. And the opposite of a euphemism is a dysphemism, although people don't tend to use this term very much. You can see the prefix eu, which means good, like euphony or euphoria. Okay, and then dys has a negative meaning there. Now, euphemism is not bad in and of itself. There are times when it's quite useful. It is interesting, though, because it sort of makes for semantic shift. So we know that language changes over time, and one of the ways that language shifts is in the meaning of words. When we talk about semantics, we're talking about words' meanings, words' definitions. So a word that has a certain meaning at one time, over time that meaning may shift, so the word means something completely different. And if you're looking for a good time, find a dictionary with a good etymology section and then look up a word like nice, for example, or silly. Now, one thing that occurs with semantic shift is that when we have words that are associated with sort of unpleasant things, we tend to want to replace those words with gentler words. But those gentler words, because they're associated with something unpleasant, over time acquire an unpleasant meaning. So then we have to replace them with something else. So we refer to something as a privy, then we replace that with water closet, then bathroom, then outhouse, then ladies' room, then restroom, then powder room, and this continual attempt to sort of soften up the term we're using to talk about this thing. And if you're interested in more lavatory language, you might check out this article by Angela Tung. All right, let's play with euphemisms just a little bit. I'll give you the euphemism. You tell me what it's referring to. What does it really mean if you call a boy nice? Well, for me in college, it meant he's all right, but I don't want to date him. It was not a compliment to be called a nice boy. How about departed? Well, you know that means dead. How about between jobs? That's a nice way for saying unemployed or out of work. How about let go? Means you got fired. How about outsource? Like, we have to outsource your job. That means we're giving your job to someone overseas who'll work for cheap. How about collateral damage? Well, this is a nice way of saying we killed innocent people and knocked down a hospital. How about severe tactics or enhanced interrogation tactics? Those are very nice ways of referring to what you and I would call torture. Or how about extraordinary rendition? Well, this is what you might say instead of saying, we kidnapped someone so that we could get around their country's laws about interrogation and torture. Again, euphemisms in and of themselves, sorry, I think they have their place. There are times when you deliberately want to soften your language for people. On the other hand, if we're using terms like enhanced interrogation tactics to refer to torture, we're trying to hide what we're really doing there. And that can be a little bit dangerous, and that can certainly be very manipulative. In that case, a euphemism is trying to hide what's really going on, cloaking it in nice language. If there's a cause that we care about, naturally we're going to try and use positive language about that cause. And if there's a cause that we're opposed to, we're going to use negative language. What this means is that we may have two groups talking about the exact same thing, but using completely different words. For example, we may have one group talking about oil drilling and how it's bad for the environment, while another group is calling it energy exploration, which doesn't sound so bad. Or we might have some anti-union legislation, which I personally would be opposed to since I really like my teachers' union. But what we might call it to make it seem more palatable to people is right-to-work legislation. Or we might talk about a death tax and an estate tax mean the same thing, knowing that estate tax is going to have wider support than a death tax. Now, when it comes to gun violence or gun control, people who are in favor of tighter gun control will be talking about gun violence prevention. On the other hand, people who are opposed to gun control are going to not talk about gun violence and instead talk about Second Amendment rights. Again, we're all talking about the same thing, but we're using language to emphasize different aspects of that thing and to sway people's opinions. Now, it'd be nice to believe that mere words don't affect us, but here's an interesting quote for you. Mark Glaze, director of Mayors Against Illegal Guns, says, "I've seen polling in which the phrase gun violence prevention tests a good 17, 20 points higher than the term gun control." In other words, change the language you use, and you can change people's opinions. Loaded language. All right, summing up, here are the ideas and terms I'd like you to come away with here. The big idea is that language isn't neutral. It shapes our perceptions, it shapes our emotions. We as writers need to use language intelligently, and we as readers need to know that people are trying to use language to manipulate us and to be aware of that. Now, words have certain denotations, they mean certain things, but words also have connotations that go with them, sort of feelings associated with those words. And as writers, again, we need to be aware of connotations, use the right word to get the right effect, but also be aware that people are going to play on those feelings we have associated with words in order to get us to think a certain way. And when we talk about loaded language, we're talking about any kind of language that's meant to be a little manipulative. Now, that may be that we've deliberately used some harsh terms, or it may be that we've softened up something to make it seem like something better than it is. Now, to follow up on this little introductory video here, I'm going to have you look at a couple of texts, and I'm going to have you analyze the language and what the effect of that language is meant to be on the audience. And I am going to have you read some text related to gun violence or gun control, call it what you will, right? And so bear with me now for just another minute in this slideshow. I know if we were going to have a real class discussion that I would have some students who don't shoot guns and don't particularly care for them, some students don't care one way or the other, and some students who use guns a lot and care about them deeply. And I find that we can have a good discussion if we can agree on a couple of things before we start the discussion. So here are a few things that I think we all can agree on. First of all, I think we can all agree that guns are tools, that what happens to them depends on the person using that tool. They could be used for good purposes, like protection, hunting. Okay, they could also be used for bad purposes if they're in the hands of an incompetent user or someone who shouldn't have their hands on a gun, right? Okay, we would also agree that in America, people have the right to own guns. That's been decided in the court system, and it's in the Constitution, although let's be honest, guys, the wording of the Second Amendment is a little bit weird. Okay, we would all probably agree that we want to keep guns out of the hands of bad guys and in the hands of good guys. If you're someone who knows how to use that gun, can use it responsibly, and is going to protect me, then yeah, I want the gun in your hands. Okay, if you're someone who's going to use that gun to kill innocent people, then no, I don't want you to have that gun. I think we could all agree that most of us don't want anyone anywhere to have any gun he or she wants. Someone with a terrible criminal record who has a history of mental illness, we don't want that person getting a big old machine gun. And I think most of us can agree that while no law prevents every crime, good laws can prevent some crimes. And since we can agree on those things, we can all try and figure out what the best laws are that are the most effective and do the most good. In other words, I think we're all somewhere in the spectrum, somewhere in the middle, maybe a little more to the left, maybe a little more to the right. But again, I think we agree more than we think.